Probably the weakest fandom take I'm tired of hearing about is the order you should watch a long-running series in. You start from the 1, 2, 3, and to the 4. But the early parts are so boring, and you don't really need to know any of the early contents to get the next. No, stop! You stop that this isn't, young man! Websites are so obsessed with reheating these microwave discourses for the sake of starting shit within fandoms they have no real stake in, outside of ad revenue, and yet we end up with fans unironically asking and obsessing over this non-argument every time like clockwork. If your clock was this really ugly, manipulative corporation that's trying to self-contain your nerd rage while figuring out what kind of Funko Pop to shove down your throat next. If you follow a long-running series of any kind, the rule of thumb is to start at the earliest entry and work your way in order. Now excuse me while I take all that back, as it doesn't matter to Star Wars. Where some franchises will have a starting point and maybe do a little story before or after that, Star Wars has basically transcended this story order discourse. You look at the sheer amount of Star Wars media cranked out in the past 4 decades only to stop and realize, oh shit, I don't even know where I started at this point. Sure, you've got the mainline movies, but then you have the one-offs and the specials and the toys and the novels and comics and board games until it basically becomes this Akira monster of ambiguity. I remember people thinking it was weird some generations got into Star Wars with the prequels, and now we've reached the point that some kid could've got their start from a fucking Lego Yoda spin-off. It's such a wonderfully tangled mess at this point that the argument of start at 1 and count up doesn't work for it anymore. Western media in general has been known for this, where traditionally they're not made to have a beginning or end, but rather multiple beginnings and ends. Long-running American comics and sitcoms are formatted and successful because every addition to it serves as a clear entry point. This modular approach may be foreign to more modern audiences accustomed to the MCUification of everything pop culture. And yeah, there's definitely an argument to be made for continuity-heavy stories with clearly defined start and stop points, but there really is a certain unappreciated elegance and magic to the episodic approach, especially for something as continuity-heavy as Star Wars, where you'd think that wouldn't even be an option. Sure, the expanded universe is this big, unruly mess, but it's never been reliant on that mess to tell a story, and I think that's an important point to make clear. Even the original trilogy can be enjoyed as separate movies, with the Flash Gordon format of dropping off audiences in media res coming off as second nature, even that early on into the franchise's run. Like, do we really care how Luke and company got from the medal ceremony to the Hoth planet? Not really. I'm sure there's a comic book perfectly bridging these 2 points of time, but they're not necessary to my level of enjoyment of them. This is to say that I love Star Wars: The Clone Wars for knowing just how disposable it is as a media tie-in series. It works against the new form that is the Netflix binge model to the point that I'd say it actively discourages you from watching every episode of it. The way it approaches its cast feels like they're playing in smaller fenced-off sandboxes in the bigger sandbox that has become the Star Wars lore. Even within an episode, if I don't like a part, I can just walk away without suffering any long-standing repercussions. Like, what you gonna do, call the police? We already know they're pretty down to walk away from stuff they don't want to deal with either. It used to be that when a tentpole franchise like Star Wars released a new entry, there'd be this pop cultural synergy going on all in service to that single movie. You got the fast food tie-ins, the comic books, the interviews, the toy deals, all serving as this commercial of sorts to better hype up the final product that is the movie. Now Star Wars shows are coming in hot and heavy, and each one is treated as this big honkin' deal because, oh shit, they're bringing back Ewan McGregor as handsome Jedi lad? Where before the idea of spin-offs and side material were treated as these separate lesser entities to the larger Star Destroyers that are the movies, now TV shows are being treated with that same amount of movie gravitas, with the added benefit that Disney's made sure to schedule them to come out one after the other. It's no secret that the streaming services have become these valid sources for media projects on par with theatrical movie releases, but along with that has come the consequence that shows absolutely must suffer that same amount of scrutiny as movies do. With all their big-name actors and budgets and long-form continuity-heavy storytelling, modern series are no longer these lightweight side dishes. There's the main course. You can't load up on breadsticks anymore because everything's just spaghetti. But Clone Wars isn't spaghetti. It's breadsticks. And breadsticks fucking rule. Star Wars: The Clone Wars originally aired from 2008 to 2014, with its revival and final season not happening until 2020. Those are 2 very different eras of pop culture to exist in, and if the series had its entire run a lot later, I doubt its approach to storytelling would be the same as the one it ultimately went with. See, Clone Wars is technically a sequel to a soft reboot standalone of a spin-off of a prequel based on a single throwaway line from the first movie. That alone should inherently set off some red flags in the bullshit department, and yet its approach comes off so elegantly simple, all for the very basic reason that these early episodes didn't have a damn clue what it wanted to be. They're over here giving the Greedo species this ugly-ass oversaturation design, and the second I saw this, I was like, yeah, no way I'm gonna 100% this. What sets apart this particular Star Wars series from its modern contemporaries is its sense of scale. Where shows like Mandalorian or Obi-Wan are treated like these grandiose adventures with a proper continuity and set order to watch things in, The Clone Wars just kinda is. As Wisecrack so eloquently puts it,
we think the answer lies in the show's fundamental understanding of its own smallness. Because the ending has already been written, the show doesn't concern itself with trying to tip the scales in the fight between good and evil. Instead, it dramatizes the little things.
And it's in these little things that we as the audience are able to find the best of both worlds. Entertainment wholly unrelated to the movies proper, and yet just related enough for us to get that sense of loving familiarity. Because heaven forbid loving a work of fiction if it isn't part of a long-running pre-existing franchise. And a big part of Clone Wars' approach to storytelling can be credited to the series' predecessor, the Clone Wars animated shorts developed by Genndy Tartakovsky. Made as tie-ins to the then-new and underperforming Star Wars Episode 2 movie, Genndy's Clone Wars cartoon started off as 3-minute shorts meant to not only be enjoyed as these quick intergalactic bites, but capable of telling a larger story if viewed in chronological order. Genndy himself states in an interview with Wired, "I couldn't really do anything significant with 1-minute episodes. It's simply too short a time to tell a story. I wanted to know that in 3 minutes you could make sense, capture the viewer's interest, and still tell a compelling story. And I found that it actually worked, particularly if each installment worked to build upon the previous one, to offer an important piece to the overall story arc, then end with a cliffhanger that would inspire the viewer to come back to see what happens next. I think you'll see that each episode, despite being only 3 minutes long, has a beginning, middle, and an end that pulls the viewer in and makes him or her want to know more. Like, this is screenwriting 101, but what makes stories compelling, at least stories in the way that we know them today, is that they consist of your standard 3-act structure, with more layered stories further splitting hairs and themselves being made of smaller 3-act structures. Though in Genndy's case, these smaller 3-act structures can be enjoyed as standalones, or even out of order if you really wanted to. Genndy's first season of Clone Wars aired daily at 8 p.m. As a 3-minute series, even with Cartoon Network really hyping it up, you think kids at the time would have caught every episode as it aired? Actually, an interesting side note, Cartoon Network had the episodes available online, both on the Cartoon Network and Star Wars websites, which is really weird to think about in a time when streaming exclusives have become the norm. And yet, even with its big push as it aired, the series itself still faced another hiccup during its production process, specifically in terms of how this generally 2D series should portray its cast of characters, a lot of whom have already been introduced in live action via the movies. Genndy recalls an interaction with Paul Rudish, the art director of Clone Wars. Paul couldn't draw, come up with a palette, anything, and he knows Star Wars better than anyone on the team. We finally had to take our minds off the enormity of it all and just approach this thing like any other project. At last, once we relaxed, it all began to flow naturally. A fault with a lot of modern Star Wars is their overall treatment of pre-existing lore. Now a 40-plus-year-old franchise, no one can ever truly take enough steps back from the series to view it as simple media anymore. It always has to be seen as this absolutely grand orchestral world where absolutely everything must have grand orchestral consequences, which begins to take away from any creative agency of future projects. Not everything in the galaxy needs to have these galaxy levels of gravitas to them. Genndy understood that and was able to apply that mindset to create something smaller, yet with just as much heart as any other Star Wars project. He specifically sources HBO's Band of Brothers as direct inspiration, a show taking something as large-scale as World War II and focusing on these smaller day-to-day moments of those involved. It's not that he's watering down any pre-existing lore, but rather that he's able to zoom in so close into the lore that it goes full circle into becoming an actual story, with a human aspect of relatability again. And a big part of that was a timing thing. Being greenlit just as Star Wars was transitioning from this 3-movie trilogy to this multi-trilogy, decade-expanding, multi-generational arc, it was easier to get a project like this approved since, well, no one really knew what a multi-generational franchise would even be at this time. Genndy's Clone Wars succeeded not simply by expanding on the story established by the movies, but fully leaning into the franchise's modular nature. While each entry does build off of its previous one, they can be appreciated as standalone 3-minute entries to the series, complete with a conflict and resolution. Solid entries to the franchise as a whole, and good foundation for what came to follow, even if it's no longer canon to the series. Which is fine, but the fact that Lucasfilms decided to rebrand these now non-canon series as Legends feels silly to me. Like, you're really gonna tell me somewhere in the new canon there's aliens gathering around a campfire talking about the legend of how space jazz is called jizz? Yeah, okay, fine. Genndy's Clone Wars series ran up to March 2005, its third batch of episodes building hype over the upcoming Star Wars Episode 3, just as its earlier chunk did for Episode 2 respectively. The subsequent Clone Wars movie premiered in theaters August 2008, with the series itself premiering on Cartoon Network a few months later. Just looking at the timeline of things, it was clear that Lucasfilms was trying to figure out the direction to take the franchise in at this point. Their prequel trilogy, while making bonko bucks, didn't exactly make the same cultural impact as the original trilogy did, better known as being walking targets for mockery and cheap shot jokes more than anything else. It was less a shoot for the moon end up in the stars scenario, and more a shoot for the moon end up in a mysterious black hole of uncertainty where people dunked on your trilogy too hard scenario. So where do you go when your movie trilogy didn't live up to the hype, but you still want to maintain some sense of cultural relevance? Go to television, of course! Sound familiar? And so the Clone Wars 2008 series began. Loosely based on Gendy's miniseries of the same name, and a direct sequel to the CG animated movie that came out a few months earlier, this new Clone Wars further builds off Gendy's approach to the series, taking its increased runtime per episode and going for a more anthology-style take. While Gendy's Clone Wars relied less on dialogue and more on visual storytelling to get its point across, Clone Wars 2008 had the benefit of a runtime more in line with your standard cartoons at the time, and was also directed by this guy, Dave Filoni. Previously known for working on a sizable chunk of Book 1 episodes in Avatar: The Last Airbender, among other cartoons at the time, Filoni's been described as a Lucas encyclopedia, having a deep understanding and respect for the Star Wars lore, as well as a noticeable fixation on tertiary character Plo Koon, so you know this guy means business. After directing the Clone Wars animated movie, he moved on to working on Clone Wars 2008, later moved on to Star Wars Rebels, and was eventually deemed overseer for all future and current Lucasfilm animation projects, even getting to work on some Star Wars live-action shows, including The Mandalorian, Book of Boba, and the upcoming Ahsoka series. So what's his first foray into a full-on Star Wars series like? I don't know. Like the title says, Clone Wars is the perfect show you don't have to watch, and I stand by that. Going off memory, I probably watched 20 or so episodes out of the series' 133 episode run. But Gabe, if you enjoy something, shouldn't it be your duty to absorb everything related to that property at the expense of your health, life, and personality? No! I enjoy the 2008 Clone Wars series because I don't have to do that. Unlike a lot of other modern series, Clone Wars is pretty modular when it comes to how its episodes work. You either have the standalone episodes or the 3-ish long episode arcs, both of which you can watch independent of everything else going on in the show. I'd watch the Yoda episode where he gets sick and they put him in a big boy bed that looks funny on him since he's so small, the one where Count Dooku makes a deal with space witches, the one where they think the one clone is a conspiracy theorist for believing Order 66 is real. Just a really nice spread with the added benefit that they can all be enjoyed by themselves. Star Wars has always been the kind of series to have a bajillion pages of lore for every minute detail and offhand comment. I think people knew what the Kessel Run was when Han Solo was bragging about it in Episode 4? Or what the hell the literal devil was doing in the cantina? When working with any science fiction, there's always this element of an entire world's worth of lore going on just outside of the viewer's sight. What makes good stories isn't how much of this you're able to cram down people's throats, but, well, just the story itself. Do you know how freeing it is to scroll through a show's streaming page and just pick and choose which episodes to watch based on how bananas the synopsis is alone? Jumping around and cherry-picking episodes solely based on vibes was something I'd usually say for something like a Twilight Zone or X-Files, so to be able to do something for a decently newer show? You know how many times I've had to pause an episode recap in Breaking Bad just to absorb and re-remember what the hell was going on? That's partially why I'm scared of jumping back into Better Call Saul. Sorry, Vince Gilligan, I'm sure the finale will be amazing, I'm just not in the mood for it right now. With Clone Wars, you can jump in with a basic level of Star Wars understanding and just have at it. When Disney announced they picked up the series and would be giving it a proper finale, it wasn't exactly something that hyped me up in a way that made me want to backtrack and watch every single episode. Rather, it just made me excited in the same way I get excited about going to the Olive Garden. We doing it for the breadsticks, baby! Clone Wars remains an interesting oddity among modern Star Wars media for a number of reasons. Not only is it one of the few expanded universe media made pre-Disney buyout that remains in the Star Wars canon, but it has this oddly meta understanding of its place in the overall realm that is Star Wars media. And I strongly believe it's at least in some part due to its commitment to not being so committed. Whether you're Anakin Skywalker, Captain Rex, or Rio Chuchi, the series treats each character with the same amount of importance, which is to say, none.
Show him the same amount of respect that you show me. None.
While its timeline limits what the series is allowed to do with its bigger characters, Clone Wars is still able to maintain a certain sense of mystique with its stories. Not only due to their smaller scope, but due to this certain devil-may-care attitude to who matters and who doesn't. For example, halfway through Season 2, Obi-Wan gets a love interest in Satine, and we don't ever see her again until 12 episodes later. Pretty ordinary for a tertiary character until you realize all characters are given that level of treatment. The anthology-style format encouraging you to skip around to watch the characters you care about, and even then it's still a toss-up as to the episode's quality. Like, I wanted to jump into Ahsoka's story since I heard she became more relevant, so I started with the arc where she helps these sisters escape from the Pike Syndicate, which... So I just jumped ahead to her finale episodes and was still successfully transformed into a sobbing mess by the end of it. Solid storytelling is a product of the characters themselves and should not be reliant on any background information to bolster its legitimacy. Modern Star Wars has become this focus group approved list of checkboxes meant to satiate fans that relish in remembering things. And while its transition from movies to live-action TV has proven successful, the small hints of continuity between each show and the fact that they're live-action suddenly make them this MCU-esque project, where they simultaneously do and don't need to be approached as homework. Sure, Mandalorian was good, but people talk about Book of Boba and Obi-Wan in the same breath, as if they're meant to be direct sequels, media that can only be appreciated when watched in order and in their entirety. And it doesn't have to be like that. What makes Star Wars The Clone Wars interesting is just how expendable the series sees itself. Much like the clone troopers that share the title's namesake, Clone Wars 2008 walks that fine line of entertainment that's somehow both essential, yet not. Its self-aware sense of being this animated series initially meant to bolster the popularity of the prequels has allowed it to take bigger risks in its storytelling, unafraid of telling smaller, more intimate stories, or even stories that are just plain irrelevant when viewing them from the grander perspective of the movies. And yet it's this approach to the franchise as a whole that has allowed for greater accessibility for non-fans. You don't gotta plop yourself down for an entire meal's worth of commitment because it was specifically formatted to be picked up and put down at will. Breadsticks.